Good morning, everybody. We'll just, it's 9:01. Thank you for coming on in a timely manner. We'll just, we'll wait another couple of minutes and then we'll get started. In the meantime, everybody's very welcome. See one or two familiar faces there. Morning, Mr. Patworth.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all.
Yes, good morning.
Hi, John.
Oh, hello, Derek.
Good morning.
Hi.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Derek.
Hi.
I think a word of sympathy is deserved for Louise, who's attending this because she's one of my pupils at the moment.
You forced her to sign up then.
No, it was young Michael there, but I wasn't going to mention any names.
It's filling up.
Yeah, we've got 26 on now.
Excellent.
A couple of preliminary points. We're running this as a meeting, so everybody should be able to see who's on, but Martin Poulter will generally have everybody muted apart from the panel. And if you want to say something after we get going, then put your hand up and I'll bring you in. This is being recorded and will be put out by Anne Russo on the DRBF website. And we also have the chat facility, so at any time if you want to talk to the panel, then please just go on to chat and type in. And also we will have a couple of poll questions during the course of the proceedings which require yes or no answers, and which the panel is unable to influence because we can't vote, and we'll put the results up as we go along. So everybody's very welcome. I think this is the 7th meeting. We traditionally start by asking people who are attending for the first time, obviously apart from the panel, to introduce themselves. So if you would like to raise your hand if you're attending for the first time, then Martin will bring you in and you can just briefly introduce yourself. So Martin, if you look out for raised hands, and off we go. Anybody raising their hand?
Yes, David Wallace.
David Wallace. David, would you like to briefly introduce yourself? Where's he gone? David,
Well,
yes, good morning. You're very welcome.
Good morning. Yes, I've recently returned from 15 years in the Middle East, and have been asked to attend with pleasure by my partners, Tim Marlowe and Matt Lindsay of Kronos Consult. So here I am. I've been within dispute resolution for about 20 years, predominantly Middle East, predominantly international arbitration, although I am an adjudicator.
Okay.
With no adjudication law in the Middle East, it just didn't happen.
Okay.
And we'll see where the next few years takes us.
Thank you, David. You're very welcome. Anybody else? Martin, anybody else with their hand up?
Can't see anybody else at the moment, Michael.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's me. I think you are not able to see.
Dr. Parikh, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, you are not able to see my video, but I am attending for the first time. I am actually from India. I am a DRBF representative of India, and have been quite busily involved in developing DRBF within India. So it is of quite a interesting subject or interesting development or event which perhaps we can follow out here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's move. Anybody else?
Michael, Louise.
So another one.
Come on, Louise. Okay. Very briefly, go on.
Yeah, I'm Louise Hall. As Job mentioned, I'm very lucky to be undertaking a pupillage with him at the moment. So very grateful for that opportunity. My background in civil engineering, but I've also studied construction law and dispute resolution at King's, and I've spent many years helping clients to avoid disputes. I work as an independent consultant advising clients, which naturally gives me an interest in dispute boards and obviously hope to further my experience in that field going forwards. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Okay, well, let's move on to the beginning of the meat in the sandwich. The topic's going to be restoring confidence in public-private partnerships, creating more collaborative PPPs, including the use of dispute boards. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to ask Julie Forsyth, who's just very recently taken over as the DRBF UK representative, just to say a few words briefly about the DRBF in the UK. Julie, over to you.
Thank you. Well, let me have my welcome first. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about which some of you will already be members, but the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation, just the UK side of it really is what I know about, but it's a worldwide organisation. I have the unenvious task, not an impossible task perhaps, of filling John Patworth's short shoes, who has just left as the UK representative of the DRBF. Luckily, I have the great advantage of having with me a UK rep team, which John built, thank you John, before he left, of Victoria Tyson, Andrew Aglionby, Adrian Bell. So there are 4 of us doing the work of John, together with the hard work of Svetlana Borisova, who organises us all and helps make sure we get things done. So in the UK, we've been going from strength to strength. I've been involved for quite a few years now. We've now got, let me check, 68 members, I understand, in the UK. So it's one of the largest, apart from America, where it's based, originally started up. We're one of the largest country representatives, groups that we of all of them. So we're trying very hard to put on a lot more events now and build it up. John has started some, and we're trying to keep them going and add others. We have started recently doing a Meet the Members event where new members can meet the current members, and the old members can introduce themselves. Gives you a chance to raise your profile, but also to get to know some other people interested in DBs and tell us what you want from the DRBF, which is something we're trying to do to focus on that. We're also working with other bodies in the UK, such as the RICS, trying to build up cooperative agreements so that we can make use of everybody else's membership to build and promote the use of dispute boards. We're getting more and more diverse away from the traditional construction infrastructure type projects, welcoming people from marine and oil and gas backgrounds, all sorts of things. So we'd love to have anybody that's interested in dispute boards, experienced in dispute boards, wants to help us promote them, people that actively are interested in taking part in events and talks and giving talks will be very welcome. Just let us know. If you want to know more, the website is drb.org, which has a lot, I think they're updating it at the moment. And you'll see that's based, as I said, in the US with our wonderful Anne Rousseau and her team. And we're all really excited about the US now, I imagine, let's hope. Just if you have any questions, come back to me, or any interest in joining, or if you're already a member and you have some ideas for events, such as this the breakfast that Michael does, anything else, we're completely open to new ideas and new events, and we'd love to hear from you. So I'm excited to hear more, obviously, from Mark, Serge and Lindy, so I'll hand back to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Julie, for that. So I've already outlined the topic. I'm just very briefly going to introduce our speakers. So the first person is going to be Serge Bodart, who's an engineer, and he's been involved in a consultant in many PPP projects and works internationally as a dispute board member. He's also, as are Mark and Lindy, members of the DRBF task force on PPPs, and we'll learn more about that as we go along. Second up is Lindy Patterson QC, who's an international arbitrator, an adjudicator and regular dispute board member and chair, and is a member of 39 Essex chambers in London. And last but not least is Mark Moseley, who's the principal of Moseley Infrastructure Advisory Services, and he's held positions at the G20's Global Infrastructure Hub and as the lead lawyer in the PPP group at the World Bank. So really interesting combination of skills and expertise and experience. So I'm going to invite Serge to kick this off. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So as Mark Lavelle says, or Peter Lavelle says on RT, then do feel free to jump in at any time by raising your hand. So Serge, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I understand this is a breakfast meet and not a brunch meet, which means we all have to go to work after. So we're going to try to keep it concise and have enough time for questions that you might have. So the first thing I'd like to do is to follow up on what Michael just mentioned about the task force. So Lindy, Mark, and I were member of P3 task force within the DRBF. And really the main objective of that task force is to promote the use of DBs and PPP projects. So that's the main issue. It's also organized by region. So we are the task force for Region 2. Region 2 has approximately 8 members in the task force. Just a brief presentation of what we are doing at the moment. Of course, we try to participate in this difficult times to conferences, and active participation, you know, being part of a panel where we can present DBs and PPPs. We also, within the DRBF conference, organize workshops. Maybe some of you have participated to workshops on the use of DBs and PPPs in one of the international conference. The last one was the one we did with Lindy in Berlin in 2018. We try also on a regular basis to meet users, employers, contractors, you know, always with this main idea of how can we, you know, promote the use of DBs and PPPs, which are not used as extensively as conventional contracts. That should be said. One more thing we're doing, we produced a white paper back in 2017. That was the occasion of the International DRBF conference in Madrid. And we are at the moment updating this paper. It is accessible on the DRBF website. And the idea of this update is really to put some more information in terms of case studies. So what real cases can we present, and how in those real cases DBs were used and practiced in PPP projects. So that's one thing we are heavily focusing now at the moment. So anybody who is ready to share a case study with which they are confronted or they were confronted, we are available, of course, to discuss and would be happy to discuss. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to the task force. And again, anybody of Region 2 who wants to join the task force is very welcome to do so if you're interested. You will find all the contact details necessary if you wish to do so. So before we discuss some of the challenges of having DBs within a PPP structure, I just want to present, we don't have slides, but there is one diagram I would like to put forward, because this is going to give us some background to the discussion we're going to have later. So you have here a typical PPP structure, whereby you have a procuring authority, usually public sector, a road department or a water department typically, which contracts an entity which is created for this specific project, for that specific project. That's why it's called a special purpose vehicle, because it's created for a specific project. And this this SPV, as we call it, will then has the task of not only designing and building the infrastructure, and for that they have a D&B subcontractor, but it also has the task to operate and maintain the infrastructure over the contract period. Typical contract period, 20, 30 years. It's a long-term contract. And for this, these tasks, of course, it needs to be financed, which means that the special purpose company or vehicle will also go for searching the financing of the project. I mean, that is where the 3 Ps come in, because it's a public-private partnership, and part of the private added value to this project would be the financing. And financing is typically a mix of debt and equity. The typical balance would be 20% of equity, 80% of debt finance. So that is the structure. And we all know the use of DBs in a conventional contract, which would be between an employer and a DB contractor. But as you can see here, there are more entities involved, there are more layers involved, and that raises a certain number of questions and issues as how to implement a DB in order for it to be the most efficient and to serve its purpose, which is, as we all know, first of all, the avoidance of dispute, and then the resolution of dispute. So this is the background, and what we are with Lindy and Mark, what we would like to bring as issues is, and I'll give a few examples before I pass the floor to my colleagues, but typically one of the questions that immediately comes from this structure is, where do we put the DB? Where does it act? You know, at which level? Do we have DB for the whole structure, or do we have several DBs? That's typically one of the questions on which we are bringing some thoughts. Then, of course, such issues as the frequency of meetings, you know, the famous question about standing DBs. I mentioned before long-term contracts, so there might be issues of renegotiation during that term of the contract. Also, long-term contract means you need to monitor the performance over that long-term period. This is also an issue. Where can the DB, you know, help and make things more smooth? And then during the Q&A or after the Q&A, what I would suggest to do is, you know, that we also discuss of real cases, real case studies. I'm actually working on one for this white paper I just mentioned before, and maybe some of you would like to bring some personal experience in case studies that you had in the past. So that's a little bit the overall program for today. And if there is no question at this stage, then I would pass the floor to Lindy.
Thank you, Serge. Good morning, everyone, again. Yes, Serge has raised some very interesting issues, which I guess I come at from the viewpoint of a lawyer. But as we know, for any of you who've been involved in PPPs, the contract structure is immensely complex. There are lots of different separate and interrelated contracts. So the first question, I guess, as a lawyer, I do ask is, where do you sit the dispute board? If we accept that generally PPP is the type of contract where a dispute board would be useful, and I would suggest that that is the case, because they run for many years, they have multiple issues, and it's all about preserving relationships. So hopefully everyone's on the same page that something like dispute boards would be useful. But that immediately then takes you to this question of, where do you sit the dispute board? Now, initially, of course, you would say, well, of course, it has to be in the headline contract, the project the contract between Project Co, or the SPV, as is shown by Serge in the slide, and the employer or public authority. But there is one big issue with that, and that is that, of course, really none of the work is done in that headline contract because it's all subcontracted down the line. So Project Co will normally be a very slim vehicle and will have passed down to a design and build subcontractor and to an operation and maintenance subcontractor almost all of the obligations. So in that context, if you only have a dispute board sitting at project level, what influence, I would suggest, do they have over the subcontractors? And that is the design and build or operation and maintenance contractors who are doing the work and who will probably have the disputes. And this is something that anyone who's been working on PPP and dispute boards has had to wrestle with. And what we had identified in our task force paper was 3 different options as to how you might deal with this, which is that you set up the dispute board at project agreement level, but you allow the key subcontractors, and depending on the stage that the project is at, that will either be the design and build subcontractor or the operation and maintenance subcontractors, to attend meetings, to participate in the discussion. The problem then, of course, is there an impact if there's no contractual compulsion on these subcontractors to attend? Now, I know that in Australia, where DBs in PPPs are quite prevalent, they have wrestled with that. They have, as a preliminary meeting, usually invited Project Co to bring along the design and build subcontractor and to keep them there. So that is one way. It's a sort of non-contractual one. It's a matter of arrangement. You're depending on people agreeing that it's sensible. Another way is, of course, to include within the key subcontracts the same dispute board as under the project agreement. That's also a possibility, although you would need to recognise that there will still be disputes that are not at project agreement level, which I would suggest the dispute board might not be able to deal with in the same way. Another option that has been done quite regularly is to have a form of non-binding protocol or statement that the key subcontractors sign, whereby they say that they will cooperate with the project agreement dispute board, they will adhere to its determinations or recommendations. Non-binding, but I guess a sort of statement of intent. And again, that's something that's quite regularly done. And the fourth option, which is a variant of that, is including some form of reference within the subcontracts to the dispute board at project agreement level, with a statement such as the subcontractors will comply with the determinations or recommendations of the dispute board. So these are pretty challenging structural questions, which I think everyone regularly wrestles with. It is, of course, fine when you start a project and everything is going well, but if there's a non-contractual arrangement and things go off the rails a bit, that, of course, then creates some difficulty with the dispute board. So that's something that we regularly look at and are interested in experiences, which I think vary across the countries and region. A second issue, which again is wrestled with a bit, is how long do you put the dispute board in place? Because as we know, many of these PPPs run for 30 years. So unless you're appointed as a very young dispute board member, you might be 110 by the time the project is finished. And this is one that has been looked at, particularly in Belgium, where it's so common to have dispute boards and PPPs. In fact, in our conference in Madrid, we had someone speak there who really spends his life sitting on dispute boards and recognise that he's being appointed for 20 or 30 years. a discussion that we've had within the task force is, should you alternate or change the members of the dispute board depending on the stage that the contract or project is at? Because is the skill set of the dispute board when first established, which might focus more on construction, for example, appropriate when you reach operation and maintenance stage? What I would say generally from my experience is that the construction disputes under a PPP have a very long tail. And for example, in the UK, we're still seeing construction disputes under PPPs that were established 15, 20 years ago. So it's not that that skill is not required, but there are other ones that come in. Another one is the financial model. There may well need to be changes to the financial model in the project agreement. Is there a dispute board member that has the skill and experience to be able to deal with that? So we discuss in our paper, should there be a rotation, for example, perhaps trying to keep some constancy with the dispute board members, but recognizing that it may need to adjust. I think there's also been a suggestion that maybe you don't keep a dispute board in place for the full term of a project, but perhaps you keep it in place for 10, 15 years, something like that. So those are the sort of issues that I guess I maybe focus on more as the lawyer in trying to work out contractually how you set it up, but also recognizing the issues that arise. And I think on that, unless we have any questions, I will hand over to Mark, who's going to talk about sort of wider issues that arise for PPPs. Mark.
Thanks, Lindy, and thanks to both you and Serge for getting the ball rolling on today's discussion. I should also, of course, thank the DRBF for inviting me to join today's meeting. For my part, I'd like to add a few words to what Serge and Lindy have just said about some of the challenges in using dispute resolution boards on PPP transactions. But then I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about the opportunities and why we should be using, to a greater extent, DRBs in PPPs. So first of all, in terms of the challenges, I guess I'd begin by emphasizing the point that both Serge and Lindy have made, namely that PPPs are really quite different animals from ordinary construction projects or EPC type transactions. And they've got a number of distinguishing features, but the two of them that both Serge and Lindy have mentioned are particularly important. It's the duration of the contracts and the extensive number of really important stakeholders that are involved in PPP transactions. So as Lindy noted, PPPs typically last 20 or 30 years or longer, and they've got multiple phases to them, which are really quite different. So you've got the construction phase, you've got the operations and maintenance phase, and then typically you also have a handback phase where the facility goes back to the government. And that has some unique issues associated with it. And it's simply not feasible for the reasons that Lindy mentioned to have a DRB function throughout that whole process in the same way that it would during a 2 to 3 year construction project. And as has also been mentioned, a PPP is not a straightforward transaction between an employer and a contractor. If you recall the slide that Serge put up, there's a whole bunch of players on the stage, including the SPV and its equity sponsors and lenders, along with the subcontractors handling various phases. But in addition, and this point wasn't made on the slide, but it's critically important, the government entity up at the top, that's not a simple monolith. You've got on the slide this reference to the procuring authority, which may well, for example, be a line ministry. But that's not where the story ends. You've got very, very frequently other government entities looking over the shoulder of that line ministry. Very frequently, the legislation in countries will provide either that a central PPP unit and or the Ministry of Finance will be closely monitoring the activities of that PPP. Why? Well, it's because of the very significant contingent liabilities that are usually associated with these large PPP infrastructure projects and the potential impact of those contingent liabilities on the fiscal picture for the government. So that's why ministries of finance are also involved. And so that begs the question that Lindy posed, namely, how do you get all of these players around the table for the DRB to function? And how do you ensure that all of these players, such as, for example, a central PPP unit or a Ministry of Finance, have bought into the DRB as an effective mechanism for both avoiding and resolving disputes? So these are some real challenges, and we can't ignore them. But the flip side of the picture is that alongside those challenges, these unique features of PPPs create, in my opinion, a real opportunity for dispute resolution boards to help to address some of the key concerns which PPPs currently face. Recently, I was asked by the Asian Development Bank to prepare a paper on one of those big concerns, namely the significant global slowdown in PPP activity. As was dramatically pointed out in the very recently released Global Infrastructure Hub Infrastructure Monitor report, there's been a marked decline over the last few years in PPP investments. And in my paper that I did for the ADB, I argued that one of the key reasons for this global lack of enthusiasm is the growing sentiment that is mutually shared by governments and by the private sector that long-term PPP contracts are simply too inflexible and that they are ill-equipped to deal with unanticipated risks, such as obviously a global pandemic. And accordingly, I've suggested that in order to restore confidence in PPPs globally, the contracts need to be more collaborative in nature, recognizing that they are supposed to be based on this long-term partnership relationship. And one of the ways that we can achieve that more collaborative approach is to take a look at how disputes are handled in PPP transactions. In the typical PPP contract, you've got a scheme which, frankly, normally leads to a very rapid recourse to arbitration, which really breaks down and destroys the partnership relationship. And in my view, dispute resolution boards could be very, very helpful in creating that more collaborative approach, which is needed in order to restore confidence. And that, I think, should be a major selling point that we should be using to encourage the embodiment of DRB arrangements into the PPP contracts that are now being drafted. And then finally, I want to put on the table, and candidly, it's an untested new contention on which I would welcome the comments of my fellow panel members and of the audience. Another argument for using DRBs on PPP transactions, and that reason has to do with a separate major concern in the PPP world, namely the prevalence of PPP renegotiations. briefly mentioned by Serge in his opening remarks, but I think it's worth time spending spending a little bit of discussion on this issue of renegotiations. By definition, a PPP renegotiation involves rewriting the terms of a PPP contract, as opposed to a mere adjustment that is made in accordance with the original contract. And the dirty little secret, if I can use that phrase, in regard to PPPs, is that renegotiations are globally extremely common. They may not be all that frequently seen in the United Kingdom, but globally, particularly in Latin America and in South Asia, the data shows that up to 1/3, perhaps 1/2 of all PPP transactions are being renegotiated. And this is, again, a function of that inflexibility and the fact that they last over time. But interestingly, the renegotiations are not all happening in year 10 or year 15. Very, very commonly, they're happening within the first few years after financial close. Again, perhaps a reflection of just how complex these contracts are, and again, that they are relatively inflexible. Now, this is a real challenge, this phenomenon of renegotiation, particularly for governments, and particularly for governments in the developing world. They may feel that a private sector project company on a major PPP project has very significant leverage vis-a-vis the government in a renegotiation situation, given the public pressure that will be on the government to ensure that that PPP highway or PPP bridge or hospital remains available for use, notwithstanding this renegotiation going on between the parties. So governments feel that they can be pressured by the private sector in those kind of situations. Also, governments struggle with how to carry out a renegotiation in a way that demonstrably preserves the so-called value for money of a PPP transaction. And the problem, of course, is that during a renegotiation, the government is dealing directly, one-on-one, as it were, with the project company without the benefit of the competitive tension that existed as a result of the presence of multiple bidders when the original PPP contract was awarded. So you don't have that competitive tension, and it's that competitive tension that at the time of the original award, the government could say, yes, we got value for money because this was the best possible deal. You don't have that when you're in a renegotiation. And so governments ask, how can we demonstrate that we've renegotiated this contract, but it's still presenting value for money? So against this background, it seems to me that DRBs can offer a real benefit in terms of both avoiding and dealing with this phenomenon of PPP renegotiation. Using their well-developed dispute avoidance practices, DRB panel members may well be able, in many instances, to ensure that the parties to a PPP work together so as to forestall the need for a renegotiation request. And if a PPP does become completely unviable and needs to be renegotiated, the DRB could conceivably help to steer the renegotiation in such a way as to give comfort to all of the stakeholders, particularly the government, that value for money was still being achieved. I haven't thought through all of the implications as to exactly how this would work, but it seems to me that there is potentially here a very powerful and novel argument in favor of using DRBs on PPP projects. And again, I'd be interested in hearing the thoughts of others on this concept. With that, I'll turn it back to Martin. or Michael, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Serge, I think it's over to you. Unless anybody's got any points that they really burningly wanted to raise.
Sorry, Michael, I cannot hear you very well. I don't know if...
Sorry, I put my boom mic out. I beg your pardon. Unless anybody's got any points that they want to raise from what we've heard so far. Any hands up, Martin, at all? Okay, Serge, over to you to round up.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to maybe add a few things to what Lindy and Mark have said, and maybe bring a little bit of what I have experienced in some of the PPPs I have encountered as a consultant engineer. One of the issues, and always thinking, how could a DB help? You know, one of the issues I came across is after the design and build, which we know typically what are the problem in a design and build phase. But what I see is the commissioning of that phase and then the start of operation is very critical, because this is the time, you know, when you're going to start operate the infrastructure. And of course, you will have issues to solve, etc. This is the how do you call it, the runoff period, okay? And so going back to what Lindy said, I think it is extremely important that the DB members, which were there for the design and build phase, be still there for a couple of years in that very critical phase. Because, I mean, they've experienced the issues during the design and build. Now we're going to start operate an infrastructure, and that know-how needs to be kept and to be available, because then they are more prepared and better prepared to deal with issues that can arise in that critical phase of startup operation. So that is a thing, and I agree with what Lindy has says. Then after that, on the long term, we need to think how do we address these issues. But then also during the operation O&M phase, and Mark reminded it, you know, 30-year period, things change, of course, and even the performance that typically you will find in a PPP contract, where you have a list of performance to reach with a penalty regime next to it. You know, if you don't perform, this is the penalty. All this over a period of 20, 30 years, there might be some changes. And this is where I think also then the DB, you know, could DB in place could smoothen things and say, listen, the situation has changed, the environment of this project has changed, so we need to revisit the performance without changing the whole contract, etc. But, you know, adjust the performance to today's situation, because change have evolved, you know. And so this is also goes along with what Mark said before. One thing, as a last point, I would like to bring, and then we can open the discussion, to bring a case study which I'm analyzing at the moment. This is a PPP in France. In France, PPP are still very much implemented. There's a lot of PPPs in France, and there is a practice of PPPs in France. So I've been confronted to quite a few French projects. And this project, which took place some years ago now, is a railway, you know, the high-speed line between Paris and Bordeaux. In this case, the parties have had two DBs. To come back to what Lindy said before, there were two DBs. There was a conventional DB between the SPV, so we are at the lower level here, between the SPV and the DNB contractor. What we have probably all done as a conventional contract. You know, the DB was sitting at that lower level. And there's been a few referrals, but mainly on construction. But the case came where the SPV, which is the employer in this case, and the DB subcontractor or contractor, had to invite the operator at the table, because there was an issue which was not only a design and build, it had an impact on the operation maintenance. So in this case, without having something really structured in the contract, the DB suggested to the parties, please invite the operator at the table, because this issue we need to have it discussed together with the operator. And the whole thing went smoothly. You know, it was a bit an adjustment to the situation, but it ran smoothly. But this is just to say that at some point of time, you cannot avoid this situation in a PPP where you have 3 persons or even 4 persons around the table. Because in this case, what I said is there were 2 DBs. There was this DB, which we call conventional DB, and there was another DB with 5 parties around the table, which were the SPV, of course, the authority, the procurement authority, the SPV, the D&B subcontractor, the O&M subcontractor, and on top of that, you had the SNCF, which is the public organization which runs public trains on the railways, you know, because you can imagine that on a high-speed section, which is part of the whole network, there can be interfaces with such an operator as SNCF, which is the public operator. The story tells us that in that second DB, where you had 5 parties around the table, no referrals were submitted, and things were sort of sorted out without the need of using a DB. These are the facts. I don't know all the details, but these are the facts. So bottom line is that in that first conventional DB, at some point in time, that third party, the operator, had to come to the table or was invited to the table. And that in that other DB, there were no referrals. So just to give you some case study background. Lindy,
Okay.
Serge?
Okay, I was just going to say, I was just going to talk for a moment very briefly about the result of the poll. So first question is, do you know the use of DBs on PPP projects? Over 70% said no. Second question, do you think that DBs have a role to play in making PPP projects more collaborative? I'm pleased to say 100% said yes. So that kind of bears out what you have to say. Fascinating stuff, Serge, and very interesting to see what's going on in Belgium and France. So does anybody have any questions or points that they'd like to raise? Please raise your hand. So that includes Lindy and Mark. So let's see who we've got. Don't be shy in coming forward.
Julie Forsyth wants to make a comment.
Julie.
And John Bishop.
Wait, hello. I've got a question.
Good.
I've worked with PPPs a little bit in the past, but I have very little knowledge. So it may be a silly question. I'm interested in the idea. One of the things we discuss quite often with DBs is who can talk to whom and who must be in the room. So how does that work if you have a DB that deals at one level with meetings and issues, and then, as Serge said, you then at another time bring in perhaps the OM contractor who hasn't been a party to those previous discussions, or that can they not argue that they're being prejudiced by any decision because they haven't been a party to those DB discussions that the other parties have? And is there perhaps any base for that? Are they at a disadvantage because of that?
Serge, do you want to comment on that one?
I was gonna let the lawyer talk about this.
Okay, come on, Lindy.
I heard the word prejudice.
Lindy, over to you. No pressure.
Well, I think, Julie, it's along the lines of the various options that I discussed in my presentation. It will really be a matter by agreement, whether you sign some sort of protocol or whether simply you're dependent upon the goodwill of parties to participate. You know, it really is going to depend on what parties have agreed or what's been written into the contract. I mean, I think we've all seen provisions at subcontract level where there's reference to cooperation, compliance with decisions up the line, that sort of thing. So I would suggest the first step is the contracts to see what's there, and then if there's nothing there, that there's some form of protocol or agreement entered into whereby they can be involved.
Okay, thank you.
It's just because it is one of those that we all think of, that if you're making any decisions that you're hoping people will comply with, you need to make sure that they're not going to argue. So, and that is sort of one of the first options that people seem to go to, is that there's some kind of prejudice against them. So I think just that's something maybe you should be borne in mind. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, yeah, there's a lot also about the dispute board instilling confidence in parties. And if the dispute board involves at the first meeting, or asks that at the first or even second meeting, other stakeholders come along or are invited to participate, I think then you can start to instill some confidence. My personal view, and it's a slight side issue, but it also picks up on Mark's one, is the big issues funders, in my view, because they have an entirely different viewpoint, but yet their engagement is, of course, absolutely critical. And as I see it, they are also very likely to be the blockage to any renegotiation along the lines that Mark's suggesting, because you're going to completely change the risk profile, and a funder will say, well, that's not the basis on which we invested in this project. So involvement of funders who will be very, in my experience, reluctant to get into this is a big issue, I think, to consider as well.
Okay, Lindy, thanks.
I would
just briefly
reinforce that the lenders or funders critically important in these transactions, and if you are talking significant changes to the PPP contracts, they have to be around the table in one sense or another, because they are going to have the last word. I also wanted to pick up, if I may, on a couple of points
just
that are
briefly,
made.
if we can, Mark.
Sure. Serge asked about, the experiences with PPPs, and I can quote from the report that the Global Infrastructure Hub did in 2018 on managing PPP contracts. And there's a whole chapter on disputes in which they make the recommendation that dispute resolution boards should be used. Their data showed that 22% of the PPP contracts that were reviewed globally did have DRBs. And out of the data sample, 9% of the disputes that arose were successfully resolved using a DRB. So I think that's some useful information. Also, very briefly wanted to respond to Ben Gross's question in the chat. He asked about the methodologies for appointing DRB panel members on PPP transactions. Different methods have been used, but the report that I just mentioned indicated that in their sample group, what happened most frequently was each of the two main parties to that top contract, the government and the SPV, would appoint a dispute resolution board panel member, and then those two panel members would agree on the third member, as you would do for sort of an arbitration. That's not always the case. I'm not necessarily recommending that that's the best approach, but that's what the data found in this study.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I think John Bishop is next up.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much,
You're very
everybody, for the
welcome,
presentations, John. Which was very, very informative. I have a problem. It's not strictly, I have to say, from a PPP project, but from a long-term consortium project where there's been a dispute board, and the dispute board was appointed for the project. And a major disagreement occurred between one participant in PPP terms, that might have been, say, the O&M contractor. And they had a very formal and had to make a decision as a dispute board. And then it turns out that there is a dispute with the design and build contractor on very similar circumstances. But the dispute board now has a whole lot of knowledge given to it in the first dispute, relevant to the second dispute, which the D&B contractor in that case didn't have. How do you handle that conflict of risk if you're having a dispute board for a PPP project or another major consortium project? I think it's a problem which, if it's not handled by the way you set up the contract structure and the DB structure, will bring dispute boards into disrepute in PPP projects. So I'm a great dispute board fan, but I do believe you need to resolve that problem right at the outset. So probably it's one for you, Lindy. But,
I was going to say, I think, sorry, Lindy, it looks like you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. I mean, that is, very interesting. I do not have the answer off the top of my head, but it's really a point that's very well made. And of course, we're conscious of that in arbitration. So I guess what you're really saying is that to avoid there being some concepts of bias or prejudice or whatever you might say, or parties not being a level playing field, somehow there needs to be written into the contract some acceptance that the board will have knowledge from some other matters. But it's a really important point, and I think that actually in our task force we need to consider that, because I agree entirely. You need to deal with that going forward, and I hadn't actually thought of that particular point. Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting point.
I would briefly add that you've got a little more flexibility, of course, when you're dealing with a DRB than you would in an arbitration setting. You know, the strict rules about hearing all of the parties don't necessarily pertain, but obviously it has to meet some basic tests of fairness, and that's the question that John has raised. So yeah, it's a valid point. You've got a little more flexibility in a DRB than you would in other settings, but still you can't ignore those basic fairness issues.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Louise, I think you had your hand up. Louise Hall.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, what are the main causes of needing to renegotiate the contract early on? Because you mentioned that a lot of those negotiations happen in the starting years. So I just wonder, what's prompting that?
Serge, do you want to pick that one up?
I think I will leave the floor to Mark. Yeah.
Mark, okay, off you go.
Yeah, again, there's data on this in the Global Infrastructure Hub report. They are, it's first of all important to note that renegotiation requests are initiated not just by the project company side, the private sector side, but also by government sides. And, they may arise due to perceptions that there's windfall profits happening. On the private sector side, they can be driven by unanticipated construction costs that were greater than had been expected at the time of the bid. A change in tariffs are a big one, and government policy changes are obviously big factors. Those are the sort of official, if you will, reasons for the renegotiation. But there is some suggestion that what is all too frequently happening is what's politely called opportunistic behavior, that there are many instances around the world of bidders consciously, deliberately putting in very, very low prices in order to win the contract, and then aggressively renegotiating it shortly thereafter. If a government has signaled that it is prepared to entertain renegotiations, then you do get that kind of opportunistic behavior taking place, and that has been a problem in a number of countries.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Do we have any other anybody else who wants to put a question or make an observation? Martin, anybody got their hands up here?
Christopher Martin.
Christopher Martin. Christopher, over to you. Please unmute. Good. Thank you.
Everybody, it's been an enlightening series of talks. I must confess I am hopelessly out of my depth on this because my background is biochemistry, medicine and law.
Michael, we don't hear.
Yeah, Christopher, could you turn up the volume a bit, do we think?
Yes.
We'll get close to the microphone.
Or get close to the microphone.
Yeah, let's try that. Is that better?
Bit.
Better now?
A bit, yeah, go on.
Okay, right. Just do that, so I'll readjust. Again, the question is really for Lindy. When I did contract years ago, my understanding is if parties to a contract wish to change the contract, that creates a novation of contract, and all parties have to sign up to that contract. Is that the situation with PPP?
Lindy, over to you.
Yeah, Christopher, I'm not sure that novation is the issue. I think the bigger issues are ones of public procurement, which again is a huge issue if you're having to renegotiate because you know, the unsuccessful bidders will potentially kick up a fuss if they're still around. Now, novation would tend to be the issue where a party is being replaced. But I think what we're talking about here is revising the terms of a contract rather than changing the parties. I mean, parties do sometimes get replaced, but I think we're talking more here about changing the terms or the risk profile.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Lindy. I think it's the first time we've mentioned public procurement. I mean, those rules have a big impact on all this, and including also even on the selection of the body to appoint the dispute board, or indeed the dispute board itself. Do we have any other takers? We're just about on an hour, but we can run for a few more minutes if everybody's happy. Anybody else got anything they'd like to? Here we go. David Wallace. David, over to you.
Hi, so it's a very quick question, and it's more about the source, the quality, and the numbers of the people that would make up the panels of the DB. Would there be a single source, for example, BRB? Would there be multiple contracts for dispute panelists? How do you see that working?
Well, that's an interesting point. But that follows on from my point about public procurement. Serge, go on.
Yeah, maybe just as a practical reference, in my experience, there were the DRB, in this case I just mentioned, the DRB was selected from different sources. There was not one source. I mean,
okay.
Would run, you know, the typical way, contractor or authority on one side, SPV on the other side, and then the third member would be nominated. That's my experience.
Lindy, did you want to jump in?
No, I
Okay.
think sometimes the contract provides it as well. They identify members. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of the skill sets, which I think David was also driving at, normally what you find, and certainly what is recommended in this Global Infrastructure Hub report, is you need people with engineering skills, you need people with costing skills, you need people with legal skills, because again, these are quite complex contracts. And so it's that kind of mix that you will typically see on a DRB panel for a PPP.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I mean, just on that subject, I know John Patworth has views on the need for a kind of, if you like, a gold standard, a pool of people who can actually do this work. I don't know whether you want to make a comment, John.
Well, not really. Thanks for picking on me, Michael.
I didn't think I'd let you get away scot-free.
I don't think there's, I think the most important thing about a DAB is that the people enjoy each other's company and can get on together. If you've got a team that can get on, you can do pretty well anything. The only observation I would make is if you're, sorry, I shouldn't laugh really, but if you're expecting somebody to be around for 30 years, you better be sure when you choose them at the start that they're likely to last the course.
Well, some of the fairly long-term projects, they might not yet have been born, of course. Okay, thanks, John. Maybe one final question, Dr. Ross. Dr. Ross, Derek, can you unmute, mate?
Could I go back to Julie's and John Bishop's topic about people being involved in multiple DBs? I think it probably boils down to disclosure. There are two levels really: disclosure of what you're on, and the other is disclosure of what you know. But I think you need to be very transparent about the DBs you've been on and the parties you've been associated with. And on other DBs, you're going to learn things that may have an impact on a particular DB. And certainly as an adjudicator, if parties or a party is spreading a line that, in my experience, is not correct, the adjudicator will have an obligation to actually reality test with that party and say, okay, this is what you're putting forward, but is that in fact, how do you come to that conclusion? And in DBs, we have this wonderful problem that during a DB hearing, the DB is not entitled or is actually in breach of its obligations if it expresses a view during a hearing. And very often it can be very difficult to actually ask a question without actually expressing a view. But to come back to Julie's point and John Bishop's point, I think it is very much a matter of totally transparent disclosure of, even if you think it's not necessary and doesn't violate the IBA traffic lights, it's important that people know where you've been and where you come from. And I think it's up to the dispute resolver to declare any particular facts that they're aware of that have a bearing on the issue in dispute.
Well, thank you, Derek. And as we wait, now we've been waiting for 363 days, I think, for the Supreme Court, UK Supreme Court decision.
Oh yes, in Halliburton and Chubb.
Halliburton Chubb. It's the 12th and 13th of November last year.
Yeah,
Lindy, do you have any observations on Derek's rather astute point?
No.
No? Okay, good. Serge or Mark, any thoughts?
Is that good?
Yeah, that's good. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's very good. You knocked us out.
Yeah, I mean, disclosure for me is clear. And then also adherence of the parties. I mean, if the parties are fine, then that's another important aspect of that issue. Yeah.
Mark, any final thoughts?
Agree completely with the last point about disclosure and about, as I said, and as Serge just said, getting the parties to buy into the DRB concept, and that includes all of the parties affected by the decision.
Okay. Well, unless anybody else has got any burning desire to ask a question or make any observations, Martin, can we see anybody? I was going to wrap it up.
No, I think that's it, Michael.
Okay. Well, we had we started off with well, we did quite well. We had 36 people booked. We had 30 people on at the beginning. And I think we've drifted down through 29 to 26. So thank you very much for your attention. And thank you also to people who were on the call from as far away as Romania and also from India. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Serge, Lindy and Mark, and also for all of those who contributed. So we can't really do applause, but anyway, thank you very much to the three of you, and thank you for your time in putting this together. I think certainly I think we've all learned a lot about the task force. I'm certainly going to have a look at the Global Infrastructure Hub report. That looks extremely interesting. And we look forward to our next meeting, which will probably be at some point in January. This will be once again a difficult act to follow. Thank you very much, everybody. I was going to suggest Lindy, Mark and Serge, maybe would you like to stay on the call? We'll just have a quick wrap up amongst ourselves. And then Martin, if you'd like to get everybody else to leave the meeting, that would be great. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great and safe day.